Welcome to a deep dive. Today we're exploring the life of someone who, well, really shifted how we see the world, Charles Darwin. And when you picture Darwin, you probably see the serious portrait, the older gentleman, the thinker behind evolution.
That image is definitely iconic, isn't it? But the material we've looked at for you, various articles, a key Wikipedia source, it really lets us peek behind that facade.
Yeah.
These sources show a Darwin who is, well, way more complex, super curious, and actually quite vulnerable sometimes. Not quite the stern figure we often imagine.
Exactly. So our mission here is to pull out 10 really fascinating, kind of surprising, and sometimes, quite touching facts about Darwin you might not know.
Right.
We've dug through these sources to get the most compelling bits for you, giving you a shortcut to understanding the man, not just the famous scientist. So let's jump in.
Let's do it. And the story kicks off maybe a bit unexpectedly, not with science, but with his father's career plans for him.
Okay, right. So Darwin's father, he was a successful doctor himself, and he had this very clear idea. Charles would follow him into medicine, send him off to Edinburgh University.
Seemed like a solid path, right? Respectable. But there was this pretty big hurdle, a personal one.
Which was?
Young Charles, according to these sources, just couldn't stand the sight of blood or surgery.
Oh, wow. And you have to remember, this was way before proper anesthesia. Surgery was brutal, painful.
Yeah, exactly. Just watching operations, even lectures, sounds like it really distressed him, made him physically ill.
So medicine was a non-starter then?
Pretty quickly, yeah.
Yeah.
Plan B Cambridge, trained to be a minister, another, very respectable profession for the time.
Okay, a pivot. Doctor to clergyman. But Cambridge is where things took another turn, wasn't it?
A huge turn. Something totally unexpected happened. He got completely fascinated by nature, specifically insects.
Insects?
Beetles, mainly. What started as like a passion for collecting beetles, that turned out to be the real spark, the thing that set him on his actual life's path.
Amazing. So
Yeah.
not his father's plans, but beetles.
Yeah.
And that fascination, that naturally leads us to the second big fact, the huge voyage that really shaped everything.
The HMS Beagle, yeah. That was 1831. He landed this opportunity basically as the ship's naturalist, sailing with Captain Robert Fitzroy.
And this wasn't just a quick trip around the block.
Not at all. Supposed to be 2 years, ended up lasting 5.
5 years.
An epic journey. South America, the Galapagos, obviously famous now, Australia, Africa. All these incredible places, just teeming with life he'd never seen.
And he was working the whole time, right?
Ugh.
Collecting things.
Oh, relentlessly. Thousands of observations, really detailed drawings, collecting actual specimens, boxes and boxes of them. And this intense hands-on experience was crucial. The sources really stress this. It was seeing the small differences, between similar animals on different islands, like those famous finches in the Galapagos.
Right, the beaks.
Exactly, different beaks for different food sources. That's what started planting the seeds for his big ideas about evolution, about natural selection. But it's interesting, and the sources point this out, throughout that whole 5-year voyage, he was still a religious man. His views hadn't shifted yet.
That detail is actually a perfect lead-in to fact number 3, which is something pretty surprising about his most famous book, how long it took him to publish it.
Yeah, you'd think Origin of Species came out right after the Beagle got back, but the timeline's way longer. Sources say he had the basic idea, evolution by natural selection, pretty clear by around 1840.
1840. But the book wasn't published until 1859.
Exactly.
That's nearly 20 years. What was the holdup? Sitting on an idea like that for 2 decades?
Well, a couple of big reasons based on what we read. First, he was a massive perfectionist. He felt he needed just mountains of evidence, like overwhelming proof before he could present it.
Okay, that makes sense for a scientist, wanting to be thorough. But there was more to it, wasn't there? Something heavier.
Definitely. The second reason, and maybe the bigger one, was just sheer fear. Fear of the backlash. He knew his idea that species weren't individually created by God, but arose through natural processes. He knew it would cause uproar. It flew directly in the face of, deeply held religious beliefs at the time. He was genuinely worried about the religious fallout.
So if he was that hesitant, that worried, what finally made him go public?
Ironically, it was competition. Another naturalist, Alfred Russel Wallace, came up with a very similar theory, completely independently.
No way.
Yeah. When Darwin found out about Wallace's work, it basically forced his hand. Publish now or risk losing credit for decades of work.
Wow. that pressure. And brings us back to something you mentioned earlier, his own beliefs changing. Fact 4 looks at Darwin's own journey with faith.
Right. It's a really common myth that Darwin was always an atheist,
Yeah.
but the sources are clear. He was religious as a young man. We mentioned he even considered becoming a
Oh,
clergyman.
that changed over time.
It did. It was a slow, kind of gradual shift, and it was
Mhm.
driven by two main things, according to the material. One was his scientific work itself, seeing the, well, sometimes brutal realities of nature up close. The other was personal tragedy.
The sources specifically mentioned the death of his daughter, Annie, didn't they? She was only 10.
Yes, that loss hit him incredibly hard, devastating. The sources explain that while he never became like a militant atheist, he did later describe himself as agnostic.
Mhm.
And they give this really powerful, specific example of his struggle. He apparently said he found it impossible to believe in a god who would deliberately create parasitic wasps that live in the bodies of living caterpillars.
Oof, that's a visceral image and a very specific point.
It really is, and it shows perfectly how, for someone studying nature so intensely, seeing that level of, well, cruelty and suffering built into the system, it just became harder and harder to reconcile with the idea of an all-loving creator. His science really shaped his personal faith, or lack thereof.
Moving to something also deeply personal, fact number 5, his marriage and how even that connected to his scientific thinking.
Yes, he married his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood, back in 1839. And by all accounts, it was a deeply loving marriage. She was a huge support for him, emotionally and intellectually.
But even with that strong bond, he had some scientific worries about them being related.
He did, yeah. It's fascinating. He was already thinking about heredity and worried about the potential risks of inbreeding, even back then. Since he and Emma were first cousins, it was a real concern for him regarding their children.
And he didn't just worry, did he? He approached it like a scientist.
Totally. He kept meticulous medical records for all their children for years and years. They had 10 kids altogether, but sadly, 3 died young.
Oh, that's heartbreaking.
It is, and the sources suggest that at least 2 of the children who survived probably had health problems that could be linked to, their parents being closely related.
So this incredibly personal, difficult family situation actually fed back into his science.
Directly. He used these personal observations, this data he collected, right in his own home. In his later work on heredity and reproduction, a clear line from his private life to his scientific studies.
Fact number 6, shifts to his life after that big voyage. A life that sounds like it was pretty tough, marked by constant ill health and becoming quite reclusive.
Yeah, the sources paint a picture of him really struggling after the Beagle returned. Chronic health problems plagued him for the rest of his life. Symptoms like severe nausea, vomiting, heart palpitations, weird skin issues, constant fatigue, anxiety.
God, that sounds awful to live with day in, day out, and they couldn't figure out what caused it.
Nope. Doctors back then were stumped, and even today it's still debated.
Yeah.
The sources mention possibilities like maybe Chagas disease picked up in South America, or maybe psychosomatic issues, stress from his controversial work. We don't know for sure.
But whatever the cause, this constant illness really changed his lifestyle, right? No more globe-trotting.
Not at all. It led him to live a very quiet, secluded life on his country estate down house in Kent. The world explorer became, well, almost a hermit in some ways.
So what did that life look like? Reclusive? Dealing with illness?
Very structured, very routine-driven. His days followed this strict pattern, focused periods of work, regular walks around his grounds, the famous sand walk path, which he found essential, and then conducting experiments right there.
So the grand adventures were replaced by garden experiments.
Pretty much. The sources talk about him shifting from worldwide observations to these incredibly detailed mini-biological observations. Things happening in his greenhouse, in flower pots, even studying worms in containers.
It's kind of amazing, though. Despite the chronic pain, the isolation, the curiosity just never seemed to fade.
Never. His drive to understand nature was just relentless. It kept him going, even when his body was clearly failing him in many ways.
Which is a perfect setup for fact number 7. Darwin wasn't just a thinker, an armchair theorist. He was a serious, hands-on experimenter.
Yes. It's easy to picture him just writing after the Beagle, but that's not the full picture. The sources emphasize he was a dedicated experimental scientist his whole life.
And he kept doing experiments even after Origin of Species was published.
Oh, absolutely. He carried out dozens of experiments specifically designed to find more evidence to bolster his arguments.
Like what kind of things?
The sources give some great examples. He grew different plants to study pollination, especially self-pollination. He did experiments to see if seeds could survive floating in salt water for long periods, to see if they could cross oceans.
Okay, that makes sense. Testing dispersal.
And he even bred pigeons. Lots of different fancy pigeon breeds.
Pigeons.
Yeah.
Really? Seems a bit random for Darwin.
Doesn't it? But it was genius. He used them to show how much variation you could get within one species just through selective breeding by humans. It was like a fast-forward, small-scale model of how natural selection could shape species over geologic time.
Yeah, I see. Clever.
And maybe the most charming detail from the sources, his late-life obsession,
Go on.
earthworms.
Earthworms.
Totally fascinated by them. He spent years intensively studying their behavior, their anatomy, how they churned the soil. His very last book was all about earthworms and their massive, overlooked impact on the landscape.
Wow.
It's just a perfect example of Darwin finding huge scientific ideas in the seemingly small and ordinary.
From finches to worms. Incredible. Okay, let's talk about the splash on the origin of species made. Fact number 8. Despite all that fear of controversy, it was a huge hit right away.
An absolute sensation. That first print run in 1859, 1,250 copies it sold out. Gone in a single day.
One day. That must have set off exactly the storm he feared.
Oh, it created a massive stir. Just huge. The controversy was immediate and fierce, especially from religious circles. He got accused of blasphemy. People called his ideas dangerous, even insane.
What about scientists? How did they react initially?
It was pretty mixed. A lot of the older established scientists were very skeptical or even hostile. But the sources note that many younger scientists were incredibly excited. They saw it as this powerful, unifying explanation for life's diversity. So how did a book with such potentially explosive ideas become so popular so fast?
A lot of credit goes to Darwin's writing, actually. The sources point out that he managed to lay out these really complex arguments very clearly, very logically, and he packed it with examples from all his years of observation and experiment.
Made it accessible, even though it was revolutionary.
Exactly. It wasn't just dry theory, it was rich with evidence. So while there was definitely major pushback, the ideas started to sink in and really take root in science and even public thinking over the next few decades.
Which leads us to fact number 9. A really quite remarkable honor he received after his death, especially given all that controversy.
It is pretty striking, isn't it? When Charles Darwin died in 1882, he was buried in Westminster Abbey in London.
Westminster Abbey. That's like the absolute heart of the British establishment.
It is. And not just anywhere in the Abbey, he was buried near Sir Isaac Newton.
Wow.
It speaks volumes, doesn't it, about how much his scientific achievements were ultimately recognized and valued, even by the very institutions that might have been wary of his ideas earlier on.
The funeral must have been quite something.
A major event, yeah. Attended by scientists, politicians, dignitaries. The sources mention that his wife, Emma, was apparently quite surprised they offered such a high-profile burial, given how divisive his work had been.
A real sign of his lasting impact, then.
Absolutely. A huge public acknowledgement of his significance.
And finally, fact number 10 looks at how wide that impact spread far beyond just biology.
That's right. Darwin's ideas didn't just stay within science. The sources highlight how they rippled outwards, influencing fields like psychology, sociology, economics, even philosophy. Concepts from his work really entered the mainstream conversation.
Like survival of the fittest. Everyone knows that phrase.
Yes, that phrase became strongly linked to Darwinism. Although it's important to note, and the sources clarify, this survival of the fittest wasn't actually Darwin's term. It was coined by the philosopher Herbert Spencer.
Ah, okay. Good clarification. And unfortunately, his ideas were sometimes taken and twisted, weren't they?
Sadly, yes. The sources mention this neutrally, pointing out that his concepts were sometimes misused to justify certain political or social agendas. Things like social Darwinism, wrongly applying natural selection to human society, or eugenics, that discredited movement about selective human breeding. These are presented as things that happened as his ideas spread, not necessarily reflecting Darwin's own intentions, particularly regarding social policy.
So looking at the big picture, what do these sources really define as his core, lasting legacy?
His most fundamental legacy, according to this material, is really his scientific method itself, showing how you could explain these incredibly complex things in nature through understandable step-by-step natural processes. No need for constant divine intervention.
Right.
The sources kind of wrap it up beautifully, saying his work taught us to look at nature with both profound wonder and rigorous scientific precision, making him not just a revolutionary thinker, but also this incredibly patient, tireless observer of life itself.
Wow. Yeah, taking this deep dive, going beyond the usual story,
Yeah.
looking at the career detours, the health struggles, the doubts, that incredible 20-year wait. It really humanizes him, doesn't it? It makes you see the person behind the huge scientific legacy.
It really does. You see a man grappling with huge questions, battling illness, dealing with devastating personal loss, but somehow keeping that intense curiosity alive. It underscores the sheer courage it took not just to have the idea, but to build the case so meticulously and then face the inevitable storm.
Think about how knowing these things, the squeamishness about blood, the perfectionism, the fear that delayed publication, how his own kid's health became data, that late fascination with earthworms, even where he ended up buried.
Yeah.
How did that change your view of this figure you thought you knew?
It had so many layers. He wasn't just some abstract genius. He was a real, complicated person. His life, his struggles, his relationships, they were all tangled up with his scientific journey in these fascinating ways.
So, to wrap up our deep dive today, here's something for you to think about. Given everything we've unearthed from these sources, the unexpected path his life took, the huge personal challenges, the breakthroughs he made despite them, and the massive, lasting impact, even with all the controversy, what does Charles Darwin's life teach you about discovery itself? And maybe about the courage it requires to really challenge how people think, something to mull over.